When he was shot and killed in Memphis, he wasn't in Memphis just kicking it with some brothers about voting. No, he was there fighting with sanitation workers. And what many of us don't understand is some of those same sanitation workers he was fighting for in 1968 are still on the job in Memphis today because they have not received the economic justice that he was fighting for in 1968. They were planning the poor people's campaign when he was killed. They were planning to bring poor people to the mall in Washington to build shanties to show the members of Congress this is what the real poor looks like in America. On April 4th, 1967, he stood in Riverside Church and gave a speech called Beyond Vietnam, where he had the courage to look the president in the eye and look the country in the eye and say we have no business being in Vietnam. At the cost of the war in Vietnam was having an impact on the war on poverty in the United States. So to me, there is no coincidence. There's no coincidence that he gave a speech on April 4th, 1967, laying out the economic injustice of a war in Vietnam, and to the day, 1 year later, he was gunned down in Memphis. At some point, we have to reprogram ourselves to realize that here was someone who understood economic power, who understood why it wasn't just about a battle. That was important. But he sat there and he witnessed all the different changes, and they witnessed Brown versus Board of Education, and they witnessed the Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, and he understood that it's also about what is happening economically. See, far too many of us have gotten so lazy in that we have allowed the playing of one speech to define all that we know about an individual. We have allowed ourselves to only look at the drum major speech. We have allowed ourselves to let somebody else frame for us who he was and what he was all about, as opposed to saying, no, allow us to paint a different picture. In his life, he only wrote 3 books. And one of the books that he wrote, many of us know Why We Can't Wait, Letters from a Birmingham Jail. But I would dare say the most important book that he wrote, even more important than that book, was the book that's called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. If you open up that book, you will realize that, first of all, he wrote this book as America was burning from riots in the country. It doesn't take you long in reading this book to get a true understanding of how he saw the condition that America was in, the condition that black folks were in, and what needed to be said at that particular time. And so what we have done is we have sat back and we've said, no, let's really not just cut to the chase. Let's not just be as raw as we need to be. Here is what he said in his own writings. When Negroes looked for the second phase, the realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared. The Negroes of America had taken the president, the press, and the pulpit at their word when they spoke in broad terms of freedom and justice. But the absence of brutality and unregenerate evil is not the presence of justice. To stay murder is not the same thing as to ordain brotherhood. The word was broken and the free-running expectations of the Negro crashed into the stone walls of white resistance. The result was havoc. Negroes felt cheated, especially in the North, while many whites felt that the Negroes had gained so much it was virtually impotent and greedy to ask for more too soon. Well, then he says something that I think is probably important today. The practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the psychological adjustment is far from formidable. Having exaggerated the emotional difficulties for decades, when demands for new conduct became inescapable, white Southerners may have trembled under the strain, but they did not collapse. What he's laying out is that, frankly, it didn't cost much. He's saying that it didn't cost America much when it came to letting black folks vote. It really didn't cost much to say you could sit at the lunch counter because we were actually bringing the money to spend at the same lunch counter. But when we begin to shift the conversation to economic justice, oh, now it's going to cost. See, that's why in that I Have a Dream speech, he talked about a check stamp insufficient funds. When he talked about the banks of justice, when he talked about those vaults, when he talked about the expectations of African Americans in terms of in this particular country, what he was saying is that here you have a generation of people who built this country, who built the roads, who built the bridges, who built the economy in the South, who were the backbone in this country, and then when slavery ended, there was no real effort in Reconstruction when it came to land. There was no real effort when it came to jobs. That if you read the book Slavery by Another Name, after slavery ended, you still had more than 100 years of essential slavery with folks being sharecroppers and not being able to share in many of these jobs. And so here we are talking today about African Americans having the average, based upon the Brandeis study, $5,000 of wealth in the black community, the average white home having $100,000 of wealth, and we have people on television and in radio and in academia trying to figure out, well, I don't quite understand why that is not the case when you have an opportunity, if your name is Becky or Margaret or Skip, when you have a family that has had generation after generation to be able to accrue wealth. When you have black folks, the only ability we had was to work in the post office or be a school teacher. This calls for having a real conversation when it comes to how do you confront the reality of economic injustice. You look at what has happened in the last 5 years in this country, 53% of black wealth has been wiped out due to the home foreclosure crisis. Elizabeth Warren, when she was on my show on TV One, she said it will take black America a minimum of 2 generations to replace that money that was lost. The average American's wealth is tied up in their home. So if you lose your home, that's the wealth that you actually have. So now what do you have? You have a significant number of Americans, largely African American, no longer owning, now renting, and now you're back in the same situation because when that landlord decides to sell the property because it now has increased in value, you now got to go find another place to live because you don't own it. And far too many of us were silent over the last 5 years when we had housing plan after housing plan that failed, yet for some reason banking plan after banking plan did not fail. Far too many of us were not willing to challenge this administration on having a real housing plan, because I dare say if you're willing to bail out Bank of America and Wells Fargo and JP Morgan, you sure as hell be ready to bail out the people who built this country. We have allowed ourselves to get satisfied simply with the election of a black president as opposed to what is the return on the investment of our votes. I don't care care if you are a black president, a black member of Congress. I don't care if you are a mayor, if you are a city council member. If you got my vote, I expect something in return. And so all too often we have accepted cheap talk over real plans. We have allowed folks to walk into our churches and sing with us and pray with us, but not leave a real tithe when they walk out. See, excuse me if I'm operating from the point of view of being unapologetically black, because too many of us are apologetically broke. See, I'm just not going to let any politician, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, straight, gay, I don't care who you are not going to walk into the environments that I control in terms of my platforms and pimp folks for our vote. You got to deliver what you're talking about. And what this requires is a change of attitude for many of us, because we have gotten so happy just having an elected official in our presence. No, you got to mean something. You got to be about something. And I will challenge any elected official sitting in this room, if you want to study somebody who understood the power of politics and money, I say you should go study Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson. We have a situation where you have minority business owners who get city contracts and county contracts and state contracts, but they don't have the economic resources to float their employees for 90 days to 180 days for your check to come in. And what too many politicians have not done today is go to those same banks that they're putting their money in and say, this person has a contract, you should extend them a line of credit to float them until we pay them. Now I know some folks might say, well, no, we really can't do that. Oh, actually you can if you have the courage. Because in Atlanta, it's exactly what happened when they rebuilt the airport. When Maynard Jackson was mayor, he called the banks in and said the very same thing. And as those banks said, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, we can't do that, he said, fine, no problem. Pull the city money out of their banks. And then all of a sudden the banker said, hold up, Mr. Mayor, let's talk. Let's work something out. He also understood when it came to contracting that where the game is played, and see, I understand. See, I covered city council in Fort Worth. I covered county government in Austin, Texas. I saw how the system was rigged to benefit the large companies, because what happens in contracting is if you have not been a prime contractor before, you can't bid on a prime contract. Which means that if you're always a subcontractor, you can never bid to become a prime contractor. And so the rules and regulations are written where they'll say you have to actually own your equipment versus lease your equipment. Well, if you have revenues to buy equipment, what you're doing is you pushing folks out who you know can buy. Please explain to me why leasing is not as good as owning. But what we have is we have individuals who are sitting there in power who allow these games to be played, and so the same large players keep getting contract after contract. So what had Maynard Jackson understood? He said, no, we're about to break this thing up. We're going to break up the large contracts into smaller contracts to allow somebody to bid, become a prime contract, and the one moment you become a prime, now you can bid on the rest of them. The only reason we tout the Russell Construction Company today is because Maynard Jackson changed the procedures to allow Herman Russell to be able to bid on those contracts, and that's why they can now build stuff in Atlanta, all across Georgia, in Illinois, and be a national construction company.